Do you know what a candidating sermon is? It's a quirky aspect of the congregational church. When a congregational church needs a new minister, they form a search committee. They gather candidates, they interview them, then they select who they think should be the pastor. But then that pastor has to preach a sermon to the whole church, the candidating sermon. After they preach, the congregation votes whether to hire them. We're a spiritual democracy. And this is a pretty nerve-wracking moment for ministers. You know, it occurs to me we could do something very similar but different every week. After I preach, you could vote every time whether I get to keep my job. Can you imagine that? Don't imagine that. No. Candidating sermons are big things. I remember mine here. Because we have multiple services, I would preach, leave the room, they'd take a vote. Then the next service I'd preach, leave the room, take a vote. It's a big day in a minister's life. My candidating sermon here was December 5th, 2005. That's before the smartphone. Dylan Raiola was 7 months old. Now, again, a candidating sermon's pretty perfunctory. The church trusts the search committee. They should. And you'd have to do something really strange not to be voted in. I was voted in. I suppose if I would have preached that sermon in Danish, and you would have been sitting there wondering, why is he talking in Danish? I don't understand Danish. And maybe then I would have gotten some no votes, but I didn't preach in Danish and I was voted in. It's about that easy, actually. But it's a nerve-wracking moment for ministers. And there's a story that I tell a lot, because every time I think of this story, it means something slightly different to me. It's the story of a friend of mine on her candidating sermon Sunday. She was up for a wonderful position, a beautiful church, and she was really nervous. And when it came the moment for the sermon to start, she leapt into the pulpit and said, "Good morning," with such energy and expulsive power that her front tooth flew out. It was a cap, and it flew out, landed on the floor, and rolled under the first pew. Now, it's the candidating sermon. You have to soldier on. But here's the thing. Her sermon was all about faith. And you can't really say faith very well if you don't have a front tooth. And so as she was preaching that candidating sermon, she had to come up with synonyms for the word faith. And man, it made her really focus. So she started to preach about trust, because you can do that ST without a tooth. And trust and hope and love. And it galvanized her inner resources to have that challenge. She said it was the best sermon she ever gave because of the striving itself. Now, as I tell that story again today, it means something slightly different to me. It occurs to me that it's okay to have a toothless preacher. But it's not okay to have toothless sermons these days. It's okay to have a toothless preacher. But the sermons these days had better have some power and punch, and hers did. I mean, hers was powerful. But we need to make sure our sermons are not toothless. You see, when the church gathers, we always gather to strive after the highest moral values. I mean, we gather in aspiration and striving for what is the most ethical, the most loving. That's what we do as church. And so, we can't have toothless sermons. We always must be called to what the church is, to defend the poor, to protect the vulnerable, to respect the dignity of every single person. This is what church is. To gather in the inclusive spirit of Jesus Christ, where everyone is welcome, whether you're gay or trans or what ethnicity or what perspective. The church always calls us, always, to the highest moral values. For 168 years, this church does the same thing. And whatever's going on in the world or society, we be church. And that means to protect the dignity of every human being, to strive after the highest of morals. Always. I thank God for church. I thank God for you because you've come to aspire to something higher. Let me remind you of a central ethic to the Christian church. The means never justify the ends. Oh no, this is a high calling. The means never justify the ends. You might have a good end in mind, but if human beings' dignity is not respected or they're treated badly, even to achieve a good ends, within the Christian aspiration, the ends never justify the means. How you do something matters as much as what you're trying to do in the church's spirit. Now, this is hard. Do you realize how high that moral ethic is? Because in the real world, it's vexing. You can have programs or ends or things you're trying to do, but it might have to trample on some people. And sometimes in the real world, you make those decisions, but the Christian aspiration is to always protect the dignity of human beings as best you can. This is vexing. I mean, take a simple political decision to set the speed limit on the highway. Sounds simple, doesn't it? What do you set the speed limit at? 42,000 people die every year in car accidents in America. If you set the speed limit at 35, you'd probably save 20,000 lives. This is vexing in the real world. Are you making a decision for more people to be killed? But you kind of have to in terms of commerce and how our society works and transportation. This is horribly vexing. To live up to this Christian ideal that the means never justify the end, it's not easy. But what it means is together in the solidarity of the Spirit, we will always pay attention in every circumstance to do the best we can, that no human being is used as a means to an end, that a human being is of infinite worth and they are their own end. A human being will do our best. I thank God we strive for such a thing. I'll settle down right now. I don't want my tooth to fly out. Let's settle into the Spirit. We're in Jeremiah 17. And this is a poem all about trust. So it occurs to me in that candidating sermon of my friend, she nailed it going to trust all the time. Because trust is not actually merely a synonym of faith. It's what the word faith means. Peter Harrison has an epic mind. He's one of the world's top historians, PhD at Oxford, professor at Oxford. He's Australian, but he's not just a historian. He focuses on religious issues. And he's determined in a magisterial work that the way early Christians, well, Christians for the first 10 centuries, used the word faith or belief, it meant trust primarily, that you trust in God. When you said that you believe in God, it didn't mean originally you believe certain things or you have faith in certain theological concepts about God. Faith or belief didn't mean I give my cognitive assent to a propositional assertion. Faith or belief, the words themselves, meant what will you commit your heart to and trust? What will you lean on? It was a way of being in the world, to trust God, to trust each other, to trust the church. He studied the word in our Bible, pistis. It's the Greek word that we translate into English, faith, and pistis meant trust. He studied the word fides in Latin, which we translate into English as faith. It meant primarily trust. What do you trust in? Do you trust in God, in the highest morals, in love? What do you trust in? Before we read this poem in Jeremiah 17, I want to just teach you a little bit about the Hebrew prophets. Jeremiah was an ancient Hebrew prophet. When we open our Bible to chapter 17, we're going back to the 7th century BC. He's a prophet somewhere around the 620s BC. And a prophet, get this, in ancient Israelite culture, there was a special social role. The prophet, the purpose of this social role was to criticize the king. That was like its main purpose. I love this. They actually have a societal role whose purpose is to criticize the king, to always call the king to being kinder and treat humans with dignity, to always call the king to a higher ethic. That's what a prophet was supposed to do. Prophecy or prophets began in ancient Israel around the time of Samuel. So we're talking somewhere like 1100 BC, when Israel first decided to have a king. And Samuel said, you don't want a king. You should trust in God. But they wanted a king like other nations, and he warned him. Well, right then, when they determined to have a king, they created this social role of prophets that would always call the king to the highest morality. Amazing to have a role like that. Now, in the Bible, there's 46 prophets. The Talmud mentions actually 53 Hebrew prophets, men and women. But in one small section of the Talmud, it says, in fact, really, there were twice as many prophets as the people that came out of slavery from Egypt. That would mean, in the Talmud, was saying there's like 1 million prophets, meaning anyone could speak that prophetic voice. So Jeremiah, one of these Hebrew prophets, and the setting of this passage is the king is about to make an alliance with a foreign power. And they think that'll save them from another foreign power. There's a lot of geopolitics going on behind here. Jeremiah thinks the Babylonians are going to overtake Israel, and the king is about to make an alliance with Egypt, and he's saying, like he always says to the king, don't trust in power and coercion in the way the world knows it. Trust in God. That's what this poem is about. So you have a poem in your hand. Do you know 1/3 of our Bible is in poetry? 1/3. So since I teach the Bible, I'm often in the role of interpreting a poem. This cracks me up. My English teacher from high school would not believe this. I had no patience for poetry in high school at all. But now it's like, this is ironic. It's like my job to interpret poems. Look at this poem. It's beautiful. This poem is about trust. Now, the Hebrew word for trust is Bittachon. And watch the way Bittachon appears. Thus says God, cursed are those who Bittachon in mere strongmen, in mortals, who make strength all they're about, whose heart turn away from the Lord. They will be like a shrub in the desert. They will be parched. But here's the center of the poem. Blessed are those who Bittachon. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. Their trust is the Lord. And the only way that poetic phraseology can do, it completely identifies the word trust with God. Look how it moves it. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. Their trust is the Lord. Oh, they will be like a tree planted by the water, sending out its roots by the stream. Its leaves shall stay green. And as you read a poem like this, you wonder if you're a shrub or a tree. That's what poetry will do. It'll throw you upon yourself. Am I trusting in God? And when I say God, I mean love, and I mean the highest morals. Or am I trusting in mere worldly power? Am I trusting? Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. You're like a tree that sends its roots deeply into the nourishing stream of waters. I wonder about the state of trust these days. Do we trust one another? Do we trust our communities? Do we trust God? You've seen all the studies that trust is being eroded in our major institutions. Trust in government institutions being eroded. Trust in educational institutions. Trust in corporations. It seems like it's all about erosion and being parched in the desert. Interestingly, in the latest study on trust, Americans give their highest trust these days, wait for it, to small businesses. I actually like this. To people they just work with day in, day out. There's still trust. But the big institutions and church, trust in church is at an all-time low. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. Their trust is the Lord. Trust in that God we know as love. Trust in that striving in you to be moral and true. Trust it. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. Amen.